signing this agreement with the International Monetary Fund is the beginning of a transition away from all of the difficulties which the accumulation of debt had created, accumulation of debt which had proved difficult to repay, resulting in the default in the April of 22. Now, I really wanted to very briefly look at whether there is cause enough at the current moment to, in some sense, hold back, to sit back, to think that now we will let the system and those who govern resolve the problems which the country faces, or if experience is any indication, are we really now in a long haul of struggle which actually is going to necessitate possibly significant multiple rounds of protest and resistance in the days to come. Now, the reason I think we should think of this is that we should begin by being clear about. Yes, sorry.
Could you speak louder into the mic?
Oh, is this okay?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
So I think we should begin by recognizing that this is not a world. By that I don't mean just Sri Lanka, but this is not a world. This is not a world in which, in some sense, there is a process in which difficulties are resolved among nations and governments which treat each other as equals, or between agents who actually have power which is on par with each other. That they are in fact they are not in a situation in which there exists some forces which are in the dominant pole of the international order, and some which, because of historical reasons, including of course colonialism, are at the subordinate pole of this order. Now, once we recognize that, we then need to say that if we actually look at this whole discussion, this whole debate which has occurred in recent times, which is not just a Sri Lankan problem, we know that there is that debt is not something new for countries which have been at this subordinate pole or the losing end of global exchange, whether it is in terms of flows of capital or flows of goods and services. Debt has been a problem which is persisting. And of course, we had debt also in the developed industrial countries, but in particular, the kind of debt difficulties which have plagued the world have been something which has lasted virtually right through the period in which capitalist development produced inequalities worldwide. So then we should ask the question, is there something different in today's situation from one in which we had large volumes of debt, particularly large volumes of debt which got accumulated in oil importing developing countries in the period after the 1970s, when we had two oil shocks and oil prices went up by more than 150%, resulting in a situation where suddenly countries found that in order to be able to meet even the minimum demands that they had in terms of energy consumption relative to the developed world, they had to outlay much larger volumes of foreign exchange, which required them to go and borrow, and therefore we began to see a certain acceleration in the accumulation of debt in the south, or the global south, or in the subordinate pole of the international order. So it's not really, we're not merely asking the question of whether there is something specific in the current conjuncture which is relative to, let's say, the history of an unequal world order as it evolved in the period since the Industrial Revolution. But we are also asking the question, is there something which is different today from the kind of problems which began to accumulate starting from the 1970s, in particular with the debt crisis in Latin America in the 1980s, which led up to what people said were the lost decades in Latin America. That development in some sense got completely held back in those countries with obvious implications for living standards of those who were without power within the domestic system. Now, in fact, there is a difference today, and the difference partly is, of course, reflected in the high degree of synchronization of the debt crisis. It's not Sri Lanka, it's Zambia, it's Chad, it's Ghana, it's Bolivia. I mean, there are so many countries now which are either debt stressed. We're talking about, something like 40, 50 countries across the world which are either debt stressed or on the verge of default or have defaulted on their debt. So this is not something, there's Pakistan, there's so many countries. So one aspect is, of course, that there seems to be a substantial degree of synchronization of the current crisis across the developing world. And part of the reason for that synchronization, of course, was the fact that One, the old problem exists, that is the absence of inadequate, of adequate diversification, economic diversification in these countries, basically meant that they could earn too much from exports of their commodities and services. And on the other hand, they had to be dependent on imports for a large volume of the commodities which they used in production and consumption. So you were import dependent because you didn't have diversification. You were not able to earn enough from exports, again because of the absence of economic diversification. So it has been the case that therefore there's been a tendency for debt to accumulate. But there were barriers to the level of accumulation of debt, and in particular the barrier which operated till the 1980s or so was the fact that you actually had flow of flow of foreign capital, either in the form of foreign investment or in the form of debt, but all of that debt essentially came through what's called the development aid network. It was either bilateral debt given by governments to governments in third world countries, or it was multilateral debt which came through agencies like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, etc. There was no private operator, just a few exceptions in terms of countries like South Korea, which had the benefit of an implicit sovereign guarantee of the United States because its development began under US occupation after the war with Japan. But other than for a very few, very, very rare examples, you didn't have the private sector providing any credit to developing countries because these countries were considered to be too risky. They were too risky because they were economically weak and therefore they might not be able to generate the surpluses to repay debt. They were too risky because of the fact that their currencies were extremely weak, and you can have a sudden depreciation of a currency, which meant that the burden in terms of local currency of repaying debt in foreign currency would keep on increasing, not because you're borrowing more, but even just because of the fact that what you borrowed more, you need more, let us say, rupees, in order to be able to service that dollar debt because of the depreciation of the rupee, whether it's the Sri Lankan rupee or the Indian rupee or whatever. So and then finally, of course, there was this perception of a high degree of political risk. These countries were politically unstable because they were poor. Therefore, there was dissent, there was civil strife, which was periodically coming to the surface, and therefore you never know. You might get a government which comes up and says, "Listen, the previous government had borrowed all this money. We think that this is odious debt, and we don't see why we should be repaying it." So, because of this perception of a high degree of risk of different kinds, the private capital market till the 1980s was unwilling to actually lend to or invest in instruments which were issued by developing countries. They were not even willing to do it, even if you provided them with what's called a risk premium, where you offered them a higher interest rate, because virtually the perception seemed to be that there is no premium which can actually manage to insure you against the kind of risk that you had when you lent to developing countries. Now, compared to that, if you look at the kind of debt which we're speaking of today, this synchronized crisis across the world, including, of course, in Sri Lanka, we know that a significant chunk of this debt comes from the private sector. It not merely comes from the commercial banks, the international commercial banking system, all of which started in the period after the 1970s, really, 1980s, in fact, was when it accelerated. It also comes more recently in the form of the issue of sovereign bonds. Governments issued large volumes of sovereign bonds, not just in Sri Lanka, but in many other developing countries. Now, this tendency to borrow from the private market obviously gained some momentum in recent years for one major reason, and that major reason is a supply-side push of private capital into the developing world. Why was there a supply-side push? There was a supply-side push because of the fact that after the 2008 crisis, no rules applied to developed industrial country governments and developed industry country firms. So after the 2008 crisis, in countries which had always prescribed that you should only rely on the market and the state should not intervene too much, you had governments coming out and bailing out the financial system with large infusion of liquidity, both in terms of fiscal spending or government spending, but also in terms of the central bank taking over assets, toxic assets which were worthless in the hands of the banks, and providing them capital at par value as far as those bonds were concerned. So you actually had this huge infusion. of liquidity. And this infusion of liquidity was occurring in a context in which those countries were actually going through the Great Recession, because that financial crisis, that North Atlantic financial crisis, precipitated a recession in those countries which lasted, well, more than a decade, and it was only just about beginning to sort of show some signs of recovery when we've been seeing the more recent trends in terms of inflation and rise in interest rates. So therefore, when you had this infusion of liquidity, in a context in which the developed world is in recession, you needed to find new targets to lend to and invest in. And therefore, you not only had overcome, as a result of the surpluses which accumulated in the 1970s and 80s, partly because of the oil countries' surpluses being invested in the international banks, you now had a huge amount of surplus, which was virtually because, let's say, a country like the United States was pretending as if it had no budget constraint, and it was just treating what one leading economist said, was exploiting the fact that it had a mint in its backyard, because it could print dollars and spend dollars, because anybody was willing to hold dollars, because the dollar is considered as good as gold in the current international order, that is the principal reserve currency. So you had this huge amount of liquidity, you needed to lend and invest in new locations. And therefore, you basically decided that you need to actually accelerate the degree to which you lend to and invested in developing countries. So, to refer to what Ahilan said, it is true. It's not that there are governments in developing countries which are not profligate, which don't have a tendency to spend on prestige projects and so on. But the reason they can do it is because of the fact that the old barriers which existed before the 1980s don't exist in terms of the access to global finance. And more recently, the amount of global finance which was available at extremely low interest rates was huge. And therefore, country after country, when faced with difficulties in the balance of payments, began to borrow in excess, if you want to call it that, and therefore got into a situation where the weakness on their balance of payments in terms of the inability to be able to generate the surpluses after their foreign exchange expenditures for imports, to be able to use that foreign exchange to repay debt, pay the interest and amortization of the debt that you take on, was actually under threat. Now, it was in that context that we saw the world being subjected to partly, they're not completely exogenous, because after all, you can't say that the COVID pandemic was completely exogenous. It also reflects the failure of the public health system globally. But the point is, we had the pandemic, which destroyed the foreign exchange earning capabilities. Tourism was destroyed, export earnings were gone, global transportation was at a standstill. So you actually could not earn money through exports. But that doesn't mean you have to reduce imports to zero, because some countries were dependent on food, most countries are dependent on fuel. So you could actually have a crisis where you have a shortage of food and fuel, but to the extent that you could get access to it, you did spend on that in foreign exchange. And then, of course, came the war in Ukraine. And it was not the war in Ukraine which led to a shortage of food and fuel, which resulted in an increase in prices. Sensing that the war in Ukraine can be used as the basis for a speculative boom, speculators in global markets, large transnational corporations which operate in these markets, like firms like Glencore and others, speculated on the supply of these commodities, food and fuel, resulting in a sharp increase in prices, so that you were paying more even for the less that you were importing in the new context. And then we had, therefore, a situation in which this crisis was quite significant. You had to pay more for importing less, you were not earning any foreign exchange, you had built up this debt during a period in which interest rates were near zero, but capital was easily available. So you said, listen, if I can borrow at very low interest rates, what's wrong? Let me borrow at those low interest rates, undertake expenditures, generate growth. Some governments might have done it because they were corrupt, because they were profligate, whatever it is, but here was an opportunity. Who wouldn't use an opportunity? It was an opportunity created by global finance. So, so this has resulted in a situation where we ended up with, as I said, a synchronized crisis, because the shocks were global. The COVID pandemic was global. The effects of food and fuel price increases as a result of the Ukraine war was global. And therefore, who actually had not merely the global inequalities of countries located, affecting countries located at the subordinate pole of an unequal international order, you also had the situation that they were subjected to these shocks in a context in which they had borrowed large amounts because of the fact that there was this, the world was awash with liquidity, as people kept saying, at extremely low interest rates. Just to end, but so we therefore know that these countries now have three kinds of debt. They have debt which, like in the old days, comes from the multilateral system, from the World Bank, the ADB, etc. They have debt which comes bilaterally. Of course, the structure of that has changed because the old bilateral lenders, the old imperial powers, actually are suffering from aid fatigue and not doing very well. So increasingly, it's a rising country, namely China, which is providing a significant amount of bilateral lending. And finally, of course, there's this large volume of private loans which have accumulated in the balance sheet. Now, if you look at that, and that's what underlies the crisis, where does the IMF enter the picture? I mean, why are we all talking about the IMF, waiting for an IMF loan, thinking that if the IMF comes, we've resolved our problem and we're going to go ahead? There must be some reason. In this unequal political economy, what's the role of this IMF? What has it given Sri Lanka? It's given Sri Lanka $2.9 billion over about 48-month period, isn't it? Yeah. And at an interest rate, as I mentioned, which is almost commercial. And you're talking about a country which has 50 billion or more of debt. So it's not giving you cheap money in large volumes to resolve your debt crisis. It's giving you a little pittance. What does it make you do to give you that little pittance? Firstly, it makes you wait. And what's the excuse to wait? I'm not going to give you this $2.9 billion unless all your other lenders agree to terms which we are going to set in terms of being able to resolve the debt problem which you face with them. So you must come to some kind of a restructuring agreement or arrangement with bilateral creditors, with multilateral creditors. Of course, you can't do it to start with private creditors. So let's leave the private creditors out. But at least, China is being intransigent. It's not actually giving assurances that it will actually restructure debt and make it easy for you to repay. So that's the excuse which is given for the delay. But during this period of delay, what do we observe? That this entity, which actually is not an entity which is going to be the principal factor resolving your debt crisis in terms of access to finance, determines the policies that you're going to adopt. It's not merely that you say you go and restructure your debt, you say that you increase the prices of fuel. You say that, okay, you increase taxes, including indirect taxes in particular. Not too much said about things like wealth taxes and so on. You have to cut your subsidies or target these subsidies. You have to actually raise your interest rates because inflation is high. Why is inflation high? Inflation is high because your currency is depreciating, because food and fuel prices internationally are going up. But what do you have to do? You have to push up your interest rates to 16.5%. So it actually puts in place a set of policies which generates what we all refer to as stagflation. It's going to contract the economy even more, and it's going to generate even higher inflation because of the fact that you're going to have a period in which you're going to have more depreciation of the currency because of the uncertainties which prevail. Now, why does the IMF do this and why does everybody listen to the IMF? It's because of the fact that in this global political economy, the IMF is the agency which is supposedly policing the world for global finance, for private global finance, not for China, not for India, to the extent that India is a lender, possibly in Sri Lanka, but not really. Not possibly in Sri Lanka, but not really in many other parts of the world. It's actually not doing it in terms of saying that it's not doing it for the World Bank, because the World Bank in any case is protected because it's a preferred creditor. You cannot default on debt which you take from the World Bank because you've signed into a treaty which makes you a member of that organization. So you're doing it for global private finance. And somehow the perception is that if you actually squeeze a country dry, you will release surpluses because they cannot import so much. You will reduce wages possibly and possibly increase exports. You will create a situation in which people take on precarious jobs for a pittance so that tourism can grow, etc. And you're hoping that engineering a shift in the distribution of income from the bottom of the pyramid to the top is actually going to allow you to actually suck out surpluses which somehow can be transformed into foreign exchange to be paid. to the private lenders. Well, just to conclude, experience all over the world, and that was discussed in the consultation it's been written about, shows this doesn't happen. That actually what therefore we have is, it's not only Sri Lanka, which has gone through 15 IMF agreements and is now accepted the 16. Country after country has seen the recurrence of newer and newer debt crises in newer situations, because this is not something which is resolved in a permanent sense by dealing with the structural problems which underlie this weakness. It basically it generates periods of time during which private capital can come back again and be in a position to earn its profits. Thank you.